Hello, my name's Oscar, and I'm here exploring the world of game economy design and game balance. And I'm delighted to be joined by Charlie. Charlie, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Hi, I'm Charlie. I am a 16-year experience video game designer. My background is, first of all, I started in QA in about 2008.
Like half of the industry.
Yeah, like many of us started there. I think it's a really, really good place for game designers to start. I think you learn a lot of stuff, just kind of getting in the trenches, so to speak. Initially, I'm actually a math person. I studied math. I started computer science and switched to math. So, it was at that time where it was a bit hard to, have a kind of vocational qualifications that were specific to games. But I always wanted to be a designer of sorts. And I started in QA, and then after that, I went actually back to university and did a master's, the Masters of Professional Practice at Abertay, and I got. And from there, I had a bit of luck and we started a small studio. So my main sort of route into the industry, at least getting from QA to game design, was to start an indie studio. And there was a bit of a movement at the time in Dundee with a lot of studios starting up. So it was a really, really super interesting experience, and it was like the career sort of became a tale of two halves, because half of it was spent building up the studio Guerrilla Tea. And, it wasn't, like we were doing a lot of work for hire. We did a lot of serious games. It was just about that time, just when the 69 pence apps were disappearing. We were getting into free to play, but long before what it is now. And we ran this company for the best part of 7 years, doing various contracts. We had a very interesting contract with Cancer Research UK, and we did work for music magazines and this kind of thing. Eventually, we actually wound the company down, and I sort of used that background of math, business, running a studio, wearing all the hats, and tried to, I suppose you could say, specialise into something that was a bit more relevant to bigger projects, but still using that like kind of entrepreneurial background. So so this was in the UK, and then after that I moved to the Czech Republic, and I worked as a monetization designer at a studio in the Czech Republic. And then I moved to Spain and worked as a game economy designer, and now I find myself in Sweden, all the time doing game economy design, but I'm actually now a team lead on the game design lead. So it's become a little bit more generalist from specialising in building progression systems and metagame and getting kind of, getting the hands dirty with the systems. It's a bit more generalist and doing a lot of like people management, which is really also the route I want to go on. So after 16 years in, it's a really, really good place now.
Sounds great. I mean, one thing I should also highlight for listeners is that you also wrote Game Economy Design, looking at Metagame, Monetization and Live Operations with CRC Press, which is obviously the same family of publishers that the work that I'm working on right now is coming out of. So I'm really interested, particularly because I think we're coming at it from completely different kind of ends of the spectrum. So I tend to come in from a product owner perspective, and I'm looking at kind of, often I'm the one you call when the game's not working. Oscar, please help me fix it. And I'm either killing the game because it can't be fixed, or I'm trying to sort of find ways to sort of reinvigorate something that already exists. But you're coming in at it at a stage where presumably the game, well, actually no, I'll ask you the question. Where in the process as a designer, as a monetization designer, are you getting asked to be get involved in terms of what's happening in the flow of the game?
So do you mean in the context of like when projects I'm working on, am I starting?
Yeah, so on projects you're working on, with a game that you're working on, at what stage is the game usually at by the time they call you in to start working on it?
Okay, so I mean, I've had experience working on projects that were pretty much in the form of a PowerPoint presentation at the time.
Which is the right time as far as I'm concerned, but yeah.
So we've built stuff from scratch. When we had our own studio, we were building stuff from scratch. But I've joined bigger projects at other companies from the get-go, and I've also joined projects that are closer to the end. And it's, I mean, there's obviously you try and bring similarities, but it is like a different experience. I mean, I personally find it a bit more relaxed when you're coming in it from the start, because I have a methodology which I I talk about in the book, a method of thinking about the design. And you've also got, even, in big projects, you've still got a lot of creative, autonomy, regardless, and it allows that autonomy to shine, I suppose, for want of a better word, when you're starting from scratch. I've always been a big believer, like when you're joining a bigger studio, you have to respect the work people have done. So even if I've got my own method, I'm applying it, but also respecting the work. So it's a bit of a balancing act to see, how we can fit in and bring my contributions to the table and allow those to come in. So I've come into projects, to answer the question, at different stages, and I think it is a bit different about how you think about it, what you can take, what you can do. Every studio is different. Everybody has different personalities. It's a creative field ultimately, although I'm very scientific about it, but it's still, there's a lot of room for different methods. So I've typically, come in at different places, but I would say that I definitely start off from a probably more relaxed perspective, coming in at the start, and then bringing my own thoughts where I can plan things out from a top-down perspective.
Yeah, and the reason I'm asking is because I think there's different schools of thought. So I'm of the view that you've got to start thinking about the monetization levers very early on in order to have some, but you've got to be careful about how firmly you hold on to those monetization levers, because you need to make sure the game works. And how that will then evolve, in particular around the balance of, like you say, reward, drop rates, progression, difficulty, those kinds of things. And especially when you're trying to think about the balance from the start of play all the way through the life cycle of the player to the point where we're monetizing those through various means, whatever that might be. Now, again, I spend a lot of time looking at free-to-play. There are other game types out there. I'm not trying to dismiss the role of a premium game, but I think they have different challenges. So with this in mind, you talk about a mechanism, a methodology that you're approaching. So I'd be interested to know kind of how does your methodology work? Where do you start when you're looking at a game in general?
Okay, so first of all, one interesting thing about this is a lot of game economy design, I feel, has its heart in the free-to-play. This is where a lot of the design strategy that I've come from. And you mentioned the monetization depth being built in from the start. Obviously, it's sort of a best practice to consider it from the start. I've had some experience, obviously, with free-to-play naturally, but I've had quite a lot with premium games and applying that. So one aspect that I like to do is be a bit agnostic to the business model that the project's using. When I like to start, first of all, I'm looking at it from very top-down perspective in terms of you've got almost like hypothetical. What things is the player doing? Essentially, what's their actions, and then what's the weight of them? What's the focus? How much are they going to do that? And then I'm wanting to look at a little bit more about the top system of resources that involves, what resources are kind of exchanging hands and moving. So it's a really, really, you can imagine if you're modelling it, you've got your a basic diagram with like a flow chart or something along those lines. Yeah. And then what I do is I factor that in, and then I'm thinking about how that changes over time. Sort of from a beginning to an end. So that goes a little bit deeper, but initially it's this. And then what I do is I want to break down that. So that's the very top level, and then I want to break that down into a core loop. Yeah. So whenever if you like to read about deconstructions, on Deconstructor of Fun is a really good blog which covers deconstructions of games. I kind of like to follow that method. That's how I was taught, and I think it's very interesting when you break down, you look at the top-down perspective and you've got the flow of resources. Every game has, or it should have a cycle, it should cycle between a battle phase or an action phase and a rest phase. So you've got action and resting, and then you're generating resources and then you're spending them, and you're sort of progressing over there. So I take that overall map of flow of resources in a core loop, and then we break it down into its subcomponents. So everything kind of feeds back into that core loop. So you've always got a handle on what's going on at the top, but then you break that down into sub features, and you can of course you can use software like Machinations to model this quite early on. I love using spreadsheets anyway, but you want to get something like every game is built from that perspective of you get everything in and working, and then you sort of skin it essentially, rather than building a little bit and then tagging a bit on and tagging a bit on, which is just the opposite approach. And I don't think it's any different for game economy. You are just building everything from start to finish, or trying to map it, and then adding layers of detail within those components.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because I'm trying to learn from the hyper casual world where you would build the simplest possible thing and then layer on top. And so in some ways I'm kind of coming at it from a slightly kind of different way. I think you're right. Historically, we haven't had much choice but the thing has to work. It is a system. It's not a case of one thing happens, then another thing happens in a linear fashion. It's a flow. It's a dynamic process. And so I think this is I think the tension for design about monetization, and in particular for just resource balancing alone, is the fact that how do you balance something that is a dynamic system when you're maybe building one component here over there and then maybe later adding another, and that does become incredibly complicated, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think this is the art form of building games. I mean, when we've worked with big teams, there's so many layers and moving parts within big companies that this is the part that gets complex. And you have feature. Obviously, there's features, there's new ideas that come along the way. There's the more you redesign something, usually the better it gets. But there's different ways of working, and sometimes things come in too late, or we want to add something for whatever reason. And I mean, having it there in a coherent whole is difficult. And this, I mean, the game director is there to make sure that they oversee that. And a solid game director, I believe, will be able to, have a sort of muscle memory from having made many games to be able to work with the economy and know what's going to affect that, even though they're not doing the low-level stuff. So I think that I would, kind of put that into the game director's role to kind of hold that together. But for sure, many a times there's been features that have come and sort of broken something else. But it's a really tangled web of things.
Wow. I mean, it becomes... As I'm sure you'd say yourself, I mean, it becomes more complicated when you try to think about the scope of the longer term of the game. When you're running a game in live ops, when you want to build new features and new models and new experiences, it's where you draw the line about what you can do, what your team can deliver, but also what impact does it have on that player experience, in terms of that economy. I think that's massively interesting. Let's step back a little bit though. You're talking about modelling. You mentioned Machinations. We're going to be talking to the Machinations folks at some point on the podcast. But I think that's an example of a system that allows us to visualise what's going on inside our game loops. Now, I mean, you also talked about using spreadsheets. And I'm always kind of torn because I tend to brute force my spreadsheets because I'm not the maths guy. I'm not bad at it, but I'm the guy that has to build a business model that's going to get signed off by the investor, as much as I am the guy who's going to try and work out the systems in the game. How are you approaching that kind of let's start with a spreadsheet. We'll talk about Machinations in a bit. When you're looking at a spreadsheet for a game, what are you doing to understand what's happening in the game, the drop rates? Actually, you tell me what's in that spreadsheet.
So there's the main sort of. Let's start with a good example. I mean, there's so many, it's game specific, but a good example is a model of a progression system, a simple experience system. The one thing that you always have, in every game economy is it starts from time, really. Regardless of whether it's free to play or not, we all share, or we should share the same 24 hours a day. It doesn't necessarily mean we all have that, but that's a good starting point. And when you have time, if you know in your game how many enemies there are, what the player does in an average session, how many kills they get on average, they get experience points from there, and the time of that session. So in a spreadsheet, if you think about it, you can model number of matches, and then the amount of resources they're getting, and then by extension the time and the level that they're leveling up. So for me, this is a solid starting point for any progression system. I've talked about the in my kind of more high level thing I mentioned several minutes ago, the user journey and how this stuff changes over time, and there's a good baseline measure for how this stuff changes over time with the progression system, and basically how many experience points and what level people are getting to by a certain amount of time. And there's a baseline measure. I mean, it's obviously in reality players do things very different to what you expect, but you've really got a solid starting point, and it's always been very much a staple in every game. I have different calculations for different things. We can get into some more complex stuff where you can model, gacha boxes which open up and give resources and you discard some of them. Yeah. You can model all this. So I get into more and more detail depending on the project. I also, one other thing that factors heavily in is weighted tables, basically, in spreadsheets. Yeah. So much stuff, even if it isn't specifically gacha boxes or loot boxes that are used, the concept of a random roll is just so inherent in so many games, and you can even apply it in quite creative ways to different things, like how many, if a player plays between this number of matches. So there's so much stuff. So just having that kind of concept built in can just be expanded upon. It's like when when you learn any science discipline, even at university, one thing is solving a problem, a basic problem, is something you do once, and then you basically identify it in the future. Have you solved this problem before when you're faced with something new? And then you can reapply it. So I think that's kind of where I'm coming from. My spreadsheets
going into that a little bit. Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm sure I completely get it. So one of the things I was thinking about as you were talking that through is you were talking about kind of the gacha, but I think that there's something about, even if there are variable rewards that come out of performance of the player in the game, does it look any different? I mean, to me, it looks no different than if you had a gacha. So if what somebody can achieve based on their personal real-life skill could result in different levels of payout, in terms of gold or in-game resources or XP or whatever, then from a modelling point of view, I don't see that as being much different from whether there was a random payout, if that makes sense. Because there'll be a range, there'll be a median, there'll be some sort of curve to define what that range might be based on average person's skill. But essentially, there is, from us trying to work out how does the game operate for most people, is it fair to say that it's not that dissimilar, whether it's a random payout or if it's one that's based on your actual skill?
It's hard to say. I mean, the thing about I think absolute random is difficult to.
I'm not saying real random. I'm just saying because we're always. So again, for those who don't know, we often don't like real random because real random is incredibly. It looks unfair too often. It looks like you get 5 maximum results in a go. That can happen if it's true random, but we tend to use pseudo random. In order to smooth out the unfortunate nature of actual randomness giving us unuseful results. Sorry, I thought I'd do that as an aside for the reader. But yeah, sorry, you go for it in terms of randomness.
Can you repeat the question?
So I was saying, I was hypothesizing based on the way I look at it, that if I'm doing something based on a gacha model versus I'm doing something that has a variable payout based on skill, my modelling of the game is pretty much identical. Not quite, but pretty much. Because I'm actually interested in the likelihood of a specific individual, the median individuals. In fact, I'm actually interested in the individual that gets the peak and the low and the median, to understand the range of outputs that will come from playing at that particular point in the game. But there's no real difference for me in terms of modelling that, whether that was random or skill-based.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
I think so. I think I haven't really. I have to be honest. I haven't really thought about it in that sense. I
mean, obviously, it feels very different. Absolutely, it feels in terms of the player experience. And at the end of the day, all of this stuff is down to us creating an interesting player experience. But for me to work out, I don't know. I suppose where I'm coming from here is, I think we're looking for the tolerances in the progression process. Mm-hmm. We don't want players to progress too fast, to feel it's too easy. We don't want them to progress too slow, to feel it's too hard. In fact, one of my favourite talks ever was from Florian Steinhoff when he was at Wooga working on Jelly Splash. It was GDC 2014. I talk about it quite a lot. It had the most impact on me in terms of economy design because he talked about the FU moment, the kind of frustration that you get when you have a level that's so hard that you almost want to give up and throw the phone, but you don't. And when you get past it and you get the benefit of that, you end up feeling really passionate about the game. And to me, that's part of the process for me about economy balance. It's not just the raw numbers, but the feel of the experience. So that's why I'm interested in what's the luckiest or the best player versus the unluckiest and the worst player and the typical player, and knowing the flow of those groups over time, to me, reveals where the feel of the game is. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think, we're always going to get outliers with this, but I'm not actually sure what to like. I'm not really sure about that. I'm not really sure what you're getting at, to be honest.
I suppose what I'm trying to say is modelling. When you're trying to mathematically model, some people kind of get worried about things like gacha and stuff like that as an idea. But actually, from all we're trying to do really is to make sure we can understand what's going on in the game and its reward payouts. Does that make more sense? Sorry, you can say no. It's fine.
Yeah.
I suppose maybe rephrase it.
It depends on.
Yeah.
There's just. I think there's different layers to like. I think that honestly becomes more of a case by case basis on the game and the reward payouts. I mean, one thing that sometimes it's hard to pin that to something a bit more generic. I mean, one thing is when we've got like reward payouts in games, I've had a lot of experience working across games that have, like more of a vertical rewards system and something that's a little bit more horizontal, and the types of reward payouts are, it's just a little bit different. You're one, it's. I don't really know, to be honest.
Oh no, it's fine. That's all good. So let's reframe the whole question. So I'm really trying to get to the bottom of the modelling process and try to give hints to people about what's involved in that process. And so where I was trying to get across was the idea that when I'm brute forcing a model, I'm doing it because I'm mathematically saying this thing will happen, then this thing will happen, and this thing will happen. And there are much better ways of doing that. So here's probability of this. We'll maybe do a Monte Carlo simulation. Maybe we'll use something like machinations to map the process and work out through that tool what the average, typical, or over-egged payout might look like. Because I'm trying to work out what the balance is of the game. So that's kind of the way I look at it, the way I try to do those things. How do you look at creating those models, and what are you looking to try to do in a spreadsheet to show how that might operate?
So I'm what I'm typically doing is I want to find out from a spreadsheet the extremes. So let's say we've got an unskilled player who's engaged and a unskilled player who's not engaged, and then a sort of skilled player who isn't engaged, and then one who is engaged. So you've got four kind of archetypes of players. Maybe it's done slightly differently. Maybe it's somebody with a social focus, or somebody who with a killer focus, for example. And then what I would do is I would try and build like a model of progression of resources, of soft currency gathering, etc. Crafting materials, whatever the case might be, and then I would try and model that to basically, show what those kind of randomly generated extremes are based on the model, because you can't sort of simulate human behaviour as such, but you can get it. I think the whole point of the spreadsheet we're trying to get at is you are just getting the outliers, or an average. I think the thing that I was thinking about was, I don't really see. I never really saw the connection between the human behaviour in the games and the random. I mean, people should form a bell curve, like in average. You
in
get
theory,
people who are very good and people who are very bad, and most people are in the middle. And and likewise, when you have random simulation, you have not that. I mean, you might. I mean. You probably will level out somewhere in the middle, but you can, like if you take a snapshot of that, you've got people who are, you've got the pure random is can show odd patterns or kind of consistent patterns, for example.
Yeah.
So I've kind of forgotten what I was initially saying.
No, but you're saying exactly the stuff I'm thinking about. So, what's interesting here is that you're identifying one of the key dilemmas. I think all of us who are trying to do this process is that what's the connection between that done spreadsheet we have to do to understand what's going on in the game and what players are doing, and I kind of like to try and find a connection, but you're right, it's a complicated thing, and it's not a straightforward question where this spreadsheet means this is what players are going to do. I think that's kind of what we're saying, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean it's never going to be one thing that's been really interesting in a lot of this, actually, which is something that's happened the last several years with me, is that it's all well and good modelling spreadsheets, but it's the thing is I feel like we're torn with game economy both ways, because we have to model in spreadsheets, because unlike when you're building moment-to-moment gameplay, you can run the build and you can try and see if it works much more easily. With game economy, I need players to play over months to get an idea of what's going on. So there's this inherent need to get spreadsheets. But having said that, one thing that we get stuck in spreadsheets for a long, long time, and sometimes what you get is that you just get in and play it, and see what happens, because there's part of it that's building the experience of collecting or killing the enemies and collecting the currency, or you may be scavenging for loot and stuff. So that's just based on you are just getting in and playing it and doing that sort of traditional game design that way. So there is that. But I think spreadsheets get you so far. They can show you the outliers, the extremes, the extreme cases, and then typically what I would do is, if I build something, it's randomly generated, I simulate it a bunch of times, several hundred or 1,000 times to really see how things behave. But I think I can't stress the importance of also being able to get away from that and shift to seeing how something plays, as well.
Yeah, I particularly love it when you actually get other players, because I know what I think the economy is going to do when I get I do proper user testing and I see somebody actually doing it. But for me, the ultimate is being able to run kind of tests that don't have people that have any emotional connection with me whatsoever, and looking at raw data and looking at how the flow of the game works. And because that's the dilemma, we have to complete the game in order to have scaled numbers of people play the game, in order to understand if the guesses that we put in place in the flow and the payoff and the difficulty curves actually match a good experience. Is that fair to say?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
No. I'm just saying, it strikes me that we have to do most of the work to make the game before we have the system working sufficiently to check if the spreadsheet that we use to craft the mechanics actually matches players' experience.
Yeah, for sure. 100%. Yeah. Like we kind of build it, right, model it, and then we would always just want to get something in as quick as possible, and then we kind of cross-reference back. When I'm building something, I mean, in general, like the further a game goes along, I'm a big believer in getting it into the hands of the players to test something, or testers who are specialised in play testing and looking beyond what they see in a half-built game. But it's really nice to kind of have those 3 points of attack for it. So you got your simulations, you're building to model the extreme cases or whatever. Then you have your players playtesting and giving feedback to that, and then at some point you're going to have actual players playing to give so you've got that 3 points, and of course data. By that you're looking at your analytics, which I'm also huge believer in sort of data inspired design, and so that's all been like the sort of 3, let's say the 3 point of attack with it is a good way to get the overall feel for it. But when players are playing, like, I can't stress how much it is to get the feel as well, you know. But I'm a real math guy. I love the numbers, but it's a bit of everything. But definitely, you want to look back and see if what you've kind of modelled is holding tight. It doesn't. I've not found it to be. It gives a gauge, I think, more.
Yeah.
You know, I think it really is a gauge. I think, you know, it's amazing how many people do things that you don't expect.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, bugs that seem to pervert the kind of intended flow of something in ways that you would never have imagined. You know, it's that sort of stuff I find fascinating. But to me, that's kind of part of the joy of game making, isn't it? It's when, for example, I love the little mechanics where players form their own way of doing things. Like my favourite one is the way Heyday players decided to use the sharing, you know, the sort of sell your product system as a language, so that they could actually do bigger sales than you would otherwise be able to do, just by the placing of a certain ingredient in a certain slot would communicate to other people what they would then need to do next in order to get just magical that stuff emerged completely organically out of the player base. That the team at Superstar had no idea, they had no intention of this. And that stuff I found magical. I also particularly like your phrase, data-inspired design. I think that's really key to this stuff. So moving forward, so we talked about spreadsheets. Let's for people who don't know, do you want to describe Machinations and is it a tool you use regularly, or is it just a tool you kind of find interesting?
I found a tool I found interesting. Basically, it's like a tool which allows you to visually script out like the flow of resources, basically, in a game. I've found it useful for actually making it almost like an interact, or a kind of, to bring to life that core loop diagram. Actually bring something more to life. I've not specifically used it for the lower level stuff, or I've not connected it up into the game directly. But it for me, it's always helped to give a high level view of things. I have not used it vast amount, definitely not recently. We've been working with different custom backends to create our economy settings, and also other kind of commercial products, game backends as a service systems. It's always been a separate thing to model how things would behave. I think it's very interesting. It's really good for that, because it does. I think it can maybe inspire you sometimes in ways that the spreadsheet can't. Obviously you want to. With all game economy, you kind of want to keep things a bit simple and not overcomplicate. And I think maybe Machinations can help you do that, and maybe see if you're going to get too complicated. But it's certainly been good for it's quite hard. It's a hard concept to describe, but it's visual in a different way to Excel. I find Excel very visual, in a strange way. It looks like table of numbers for me, but it is visual. It's very a logical process. Contrary to that, when I was never particularly much for being programmer, because I could never really think through it, because I couldn't really see it in the right way. But both Excel and Machinations I can see, and I really like the way Machinations works. I think it was one of these things it's generally, it actually is fun to use as a designer in the early phases.
It is. Yeah. I totally agree. Yeah, I mean, for me, I think I'm a bit like you in the sense that I think system thinking, and spreadsheets actually work really well if you are able to sort of you kind of need to visualize the matrix in your head. You need to sort of understand that thing is leading to that thing, is leading to that thing, and this is the result of this, and therefore they get that much payout. If they get that much payout, then they'll progress this much. That means the next encounter they have is likely to be this difficult in terms of their likelihood of completing it or not. Therefore, but I think that the number of times I've ended up kind of building much more complicated spreadsheets than I ever really needed to, simply because I didn't take the time to step back and think about the flow in a more systematic way. I kind of kept not adding, but kept trying to explore what's the consequence of this, how does that interact with that, what does that do to this number. So given that in mind, how do you avoid going down the rabbit hole? I mean, do you have any kind of lower level sort of techniques that you would recommend people think about that kind of stop them overcomplicating the analysis of the game balance?
It's quite difficult to say. I mean, one thing, low-level techniques. Honestly, sometimes, especially like an experience from working within a design team, is to try and explain what you're doing to somebody. Show it to a co-worker who doesn't do that, but obviously is quite versed in game design, and see like what they think about what you're doing, or trying to explain your system. I mean, I think it comes back to, like, as another kind of analogy, with a game design, a lot of people talk about game designs, and if you bullet point it, from going from speech to put it in a bullet point of how you describe it, you can usually see the flaw in it straight away. And I think there could be something roughly along those lines here as well. You're obviously going to start with a document how you want to plan stuff out, but then if you try and model something, you keep modeling, you go really deep into it. You might not see the wood from the trees a little bit, and then you do spend a lot of time just with numbers, and you have to kind of first of all remember that you can balance numbers in games to the end of time. It's not going to be perfect, and then obviously, like, taking a step back, I think this is where the importance comes, and it's something I've been guilty of in the past, is really playing the game that you're making, and seeing what happens, because you probably you get to a point. Because I'm like quite commercially minded, I'm thinking of a time, a budget, and a product that we need to ship.
Absolutely.
And at some point, you get to that point where we need to make a game, right? You can think about all the things that would be cool, but we need to actually release it. Then you can get to that point where you just play it and see what's happening. At some point, you've got co-workers who are working on systems, and you just snap out of it, really. But it's part of. I think it's part of being experienced, knowing what works, not what doesn't. How to keep things simple. I think we can get really, really deep into complexity, and it's quite a seminal moment for the first time you get into something that's really complex. But I really like to keep things simple. If need be, because I've tried to go complex, and it doesn't necessarily work as such.
No. I mean, I totally agree. And actually, one of my tricks, particularly where I've got a game system that's I'm inheriting, is I'm looking for what I call an anchor. An anchor being something you only get through play. So particularly because obviously I'm often going in when there's a monetization question. So where people can, how much should I price a particular currency at, or how much should I put in a bundle? What specific things should I offer? I think being able to go back to an anchor currency of some sort that can only, XP can be one, but gold potentially could be one, whatever it might be. But knowing the rate at which it can be earned, and that rate is directly attributed to sort of known progression mechanics, can be massively important. And this particularly pays off when you say, for example, make a battle pass, and you use a seasonal currency in the battle pass that is only through play. So you've got to, for example, do certain challenges. Each challenge gives you a certain amount of finite currency for the season pass. You can then get anything in the season pass by spending that currency, and at the end of that season, if you haven't got everything, the currency you've got converts to something, let's say a hard currency of some sort. So you could then go and buy it in the store, for example, if you were to offer it in the store later. So it's things like that, being able to know, because I know how much you've done in the game if I've set a set of challenges, each of which has a finite amount of currency in them, to know that how far you've got through the game. Without having to get into the complexity and the mess and the kind of questions about the variable rewards and all that kind of stuff. But again, it's a kind of a sticking plaster, kind of like cheat code way to do it. Do you have any kind of cheat code methods like that you would employ?
Cheat code, I don't know. Interesting. I hadn't thought about it as a cheat code method, but I'm very much like, if you mean ways of controlling the player, or kind of
ways to sort of like just keep the frame, the frame around the player feeling consistent and feeling rooted in play.
So I think the tricks can relate more to maybe to free to play. I think what you're hitting on was something that's I kind of consider to be a best practice. unique resources. Essentially, resources you can only use for one thing. Or specific resources rather, are much easier to balance, because then you don't have this idea that you get, let's say you can spend one soft currency on everything. You've got opportunity cost left, right and centre. You can spend it on one thing, you can spend it on this, and you don't know where everybody is. You've got that, again, that human factor of everybody does different things. But if you've got specific resources, I mean, I think you've got all the tricks in the book. You've got session control mechanics. Your battle pass. Like if you want to give. Like I'm a sticker for XP systems of just giving stuff, but we have a lot of challenge-based progression, so you can really measure what players do in certain ways. We also had like ways of controlling players. Was that the main progression system, or having two currencies working in tandem, were first of all ways to make pinch points, but also you can like apply the brakes to somebody. You can stop people going in certain directions. Or you can make something that you have to grind really hard to get over. So I think they were all I see it as different currencies used for different things. And ways of it's more like a problem of we need the player to do this, so we'll solve that problem at the time. I do think it's a case by case basis though on the games. I've got all the tricks that I've used for like session control, for dual currencies, for crafting resources used for different things. Like what I hit on before about the difference between your horizontal progression with some players like trying to build up just pure power, which is vertical power, and then players trying to build up a different array of ways they can play, preferences. So I really do think that it is on the game, but I think I kind of agree with you in a sense, with the battle pass and that seasonal currency, for example, just translates to something else. But that's good. It's my take on what you'd said yourself was that's just a way of stopping somebody stockpiling something. You introduce that currency and then it's removed, so it's very specific to a specific time. But it's how curiously it's how things like vouchers work. Your voucher expires because your voucher for this is not worth the same a year later, right? So you have to do that. It's almost inspired by the real world.
But that also that fits very neatly into my. Again, I'm always looking for ways to make my maths not be the weak point. So, for example, that's why I like capacity. So, if you've got consumable items in a game, potions or whatever, but you can only hold 10 of them at any time, then that frees me from having to think about the maths so much, because the rate at which you earn them, if you're not using them in play, then they're going to disappear because you don't have the capacity to store them. And I find those, for me, that's a similar kind of, again, I'm using the phrase cheat code to describe it, but it's basically a way of saying, like you say, it's framing, so it's framing so people don't stockpile. So people, you don't want I've forgotten which, it wasn't Disney dollars, but it was one of those kind of schemes where a voucher code was on offer but didn't have a date on it, and so it was still valid legally for years later, and it kind of bankrupted the particular company. I can't remember the example off the top of my head, but there's a fantastic legal example of that. You don't want to do that. You want to find ways to make the game feel fun and reasons to keep playing. And I was thinking about League of Legends particularly, where I think you can get to the stage where Blue Essence, which is the currency I think you buy characters with, I can't remember, but you get to the stage where you very quickly have more of it than you ever need.
I confess I haven't actually played the game.
No. I mean, I don't play it very often, and I'm out of date from playing it. But that's an example that I think we see quite often. I mean, trying to think about. I mean, obviously, Skyrim was never intended to have a monetary economy in it that was sensible. But almost every player breaks the economy in Skyrim before they're level like 20, 30. And again, doesn't matter in that context. But for a game where you could buy gold, if you haven't paid attention to how much people can stockpile, it's never going to be valuable. If you don't have enough sinks, and so I do a lot of work around sinks and sources, or faucets and drains, depending on who you're talking to. Yeah. Is that a sort of technique you would look into as well? Is that one of those things?
Sinks and source, yeah. I mean, the sink and source diagram is essentially part of the overall kind of core loop that we're looking at. When I'm modeling stuff. So absolutely, like I'm looking for like part of the math, what I was talking about, or spreadsheet math, is to see what balances people are going to get over time. But typically, no matter what you do, you'll always get soft currency inflation. That's the thing.
Yeah.
I'm like I said, more recently I've not been working so much with free to play, where I'm paying for power, regardless of how kind of well it's integrated into the game. So the monetization aspect has been buying cosmetics purely, and that's just been a straight up purchase. So I'm not giving micro rewards of hard currency in projects I've been on. So it's more like the soft currency concerns and stuff. And then that's really difficult, because the game is a license to print money. You're playing it and you're just getting currency. But I do like to think of coming up with things. One interesting point about Six Sinks is that you've got the finite sinks where you have to be tied to content to get the sync. But of course, the content itself is usually expensive to make, and you have to kind of keep it interesting. But then, of course, you want to try something that's a more infinite sync, and your consumables are quite good for that. But even then, you obviously kind of damage the gameplay in some ways if you, for whatever reason, if you build them like from the kind of the gameplay perspective not so well. I think also there's I'm always looking for like these taxes are good. I mean, it's not so much fun to play, but trading taxes and fees for whatever tickets that you have to spend to enter a mode, things like that are really strong for us, because you have to you can use them in kind of a theoretically infinite amount of time. So the reusable sinks.
You've reminded me of a great talk back in the day. I think Toit Vedeman was doing a panel, and he talked about putting insurance into Minecraft as an evil monetization method, which I thought was hilarious. I mean, I don't want anyone to do that, but I just think it's an interesting avenue, isn't it? You talk about tax, insurance, and tax are not things that we consider to be fun. But it'd be interesting to know whether there is a vector in that in game design that could actually be interesting. But again, I'm not recommending it because of the negative connotations, should we say?
I don't know. I mean, we're always talking about like what is fun. I always think it's an interesting topic. When we I've often heard a lot of people say, the gunplay is fun, but the economy is not balanced yet. Is a very common phrase we would get in games. As is always the case. I mean, that's like kind of comparing, driving a fast car to doing your tax return. It's like you can't compare those two things. And I think with this case, you kind of have to think about it as different. There's this conflicting idea that the economy should exist and you should feel it, but then again, you also want to play it and make it interesting. I mean, we always talked about, a former colleague of mine talked about, the black market where got these illegal fly-by-night markets and illegal trading and stuff. Maybe that could be fun, in the context of the game. That's kind of probably more fun. I mean, so like regardless, like just what's the purpose of the the marketplace in the game? Is it there to drive the economy? I mean, yes, you have to put something in to serve a purpose, right? It has to do something. It's got to solve a problem. Like a really big believer in that as well.
No, completely get that. And I mean, I think at the end of the day, that's really the key of it, which is why are you building an economy? If you're building an economy just to get cash out of people, you're probably not doing it right, I think. If you're understanding what is going on in the game and how do you make the game meaningful, if you get the meaningful right, the game economy naturally flows from that. And the monetization will flow from that. At least that's the way I look at it.
Yeah, I think it exists to sort of hold it kind of holds the context together. I mean, I've often said when people ask me what I do for a living, I'd say game economy designer. They ask what's that. I said, well, if the guy next to me is building the weapon systems and he's interested in making the shooting fun, I'm interested in making why is that fun to keep coming back to 6 months later? What is it, that makes it? And that's kind of where I see it. So it's more of like an intrigue or an interest loop or something along those lines. I still think it's very hard to define.
No, I completely agree. And actually, I think you've hit the nail on the head of why I want to focus on this topic, and that's why I'm so glad you've been looking at it as well, is that I think we're actually creating something which makes the game meaningful for the long term, and I think it's just as much a quintessential part of the game development process as any other aspect. And what's more is we're also kind of accountable, because at the end of the day, players won't spend money in the game if we don't get our job right. Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely. I've always said my neck's first, like on the heads on the chopping block first a bit. This is the thing. It's why it's a difficult job, to be honest. It's quite a niche job in game design, or it is. I mean, I don't think it necessarily needs to be. A lot of people, I think, in the team are doing it, without realising it a bit. We need generally want designers to be quite agnostic to their area that they're focusing on and do a bit different things, because that's just the way working life is, I think, in games. But it's absolutely always deemed to be just hard problems to solve. And it's the game hinges on it. It's very hard to measure. I think part of the reason the questions can be difficult to process with about game economy is that it's coming up with something that's fun over long periods of time, or what is it? You absolutely have to get it right. It's one of these things that I think when it's wrong, it's or at least when it's not optimal. I'm like a believer in saying things are wrong. I've had some bad experiences with that, but when it's not sort of done as best, it's quick to be blamed. But then, of course, when it is right, nobody mentions it.
No, exactly. It's invisible when it's right, but if it's not, and I think one of the other parts of it is I think it is so difficult to know that it's right until it's the classic sort of joke, no plan survives contact with the enemy. In our case, the enemy is the player, but they're not really our enemy. They're just like they're going to destroy everything we do in reality, but we try our best to make it less bad. So I mean, obviously my passion is around long-term play game experiences, and you mentioned in the book you're covering off elements in what games as a service models do and what live ops do. What do you think is the kind of a fundamental role in terms of monetization for that longer term part? What's the sort of primary work that you do in that space?
For basically
sort of
live monetization?
Yeah.
So the work I've done in that space, at the moment I'm definitely focusing more on game economy, but what I have done prior is, I mean, I've been essentially like a monetization designer, monetization manager on in the past. I had essentially seen that as for the project I've been on, it's essentially like being a product owner for monetization, being customer facing. I've been working on more like a publishing team where we've been working with the publisher, and it's been honestly that's been a little bit away from what I'd call pure game economy design, maybe just because of where I've been, the background I've had. It's been more of a you've got a little bit of knowledge about the marketing, a little bit about the legalities, and et cetera, and cross commerce, for example, is a big topic. So there's been a lot of that, and that was like that for me is that role of monetization. I'm separating game economy and monetization in this sense. When I've been in monetization design for live operations, I do believe that when you're selling pure cosmetic content, and I've had these models, like I talk about it in the book. I've got the personalization, performance, and preference model. And we're talking about this, and that rose late to paying for upgrades to weapons. But the one that's interesting, or has been more prominent for me, was the personalization, which is selling cosmetics and skins, and that's more of a classical sales, and you can just finding what people want and selling it to them. It's very, very hard to say what people want. You just have to see what works. Right enough, we can put stuff at people's eye level, and we can run effective stores. We can give personalized offers, which are building a store. The big challenge is in building a live store is it just does seem quite simple in concept, but then when you get into the nitty gritty of it and managing it, it becomes quite a bit of a complex beast to manage.
It's retail.
With different things, like how do you account for somebody that buys this too much? But it's hard for me to kind of think off the top of my head what the nuances of it are. But I've seen some games handle it really well. I mean, the Finals, when it was released, I was very impressed by their in-game store. The way they, I think, set it up. I've not been on that dev team, but it mitigated a lot of problems that we'd faced on past projects. I suspect from what I'd seen. where when you're moving content between inventory and the store, and it was just overall, like, in theory it should have been simple, but it just became a nightmare to manage. So that's been the biggest challenges is in running live. As for overall strategy, I don't find there's any magic to running those kind of things. In terms of features, like features that affect monetization live, I also never really had much like luck with finding a kind of formula as such. You just have to see how players are behaving and then react to it a bit, even though you want to prepare things in advance. Obviously front loading plenty of content, making sure that the different departments are working together, so we've got plenty of cosmetic content in advance before it's scheduled, and then deciding on how that's going to work with all the different stakeholders. So it's been a real kind of working life problem pretty much, rather than a game design problem from my side. How do you manage
and it's amazing how many games are taking that approach. So I'm of a view that vanity, it's a phrase that I heard somebody else say at a conference recently. I can never remember who said it, but vanity content requires a vanity loop. And if the game doesn't have some way to show off, where's the social capital in having those cosmetic elements? And obviously the degree to which people care about the cosmetics is going to be partly down to the degree to which they can show off those things that they've acquired. And to me, a lot of that stuff, like you say, happens early in the game design. But a lot of the stuff I end up doing is looking at how do you monetize the kind of event element of the space. So how do I have something in the game that I can use to encourage you to play more, whether you're a free player or a paid player. My ambition is that any monetization I do for live ops is all about you wanting to play more as a direct result. I think if you manage to pull that off, then sometimes it doesn't come down to just how much content you can make. In fact, actually, it's better to make that content relatively limited and understandable, because I want to avoid the too much choice. There's a phrase for it. It's the tyranny of choice. Choice paralysis. Yeah, tyranny of choice paralysis, whatever phrase you want to use. So being able to package things can also make it easier for the team to be able to sustain ongoing delivery. And I'm as interested in the team still being there as I am the game having new updates, because I've seen so many teams die from just trying to create too much content. So
they get trapped in, for example, a content treadmill. They can't keep up with the content. Exactly that.
And I think that's such a tragedy, because quite often it's not about the volume of material you produce, it's about the way it's accessed.
Yeah. I think, I've often thought that there are, I guess, tricks for the content treadmill, like pushing players back into existing areas so they can grind for new things. One thing that I think this comes to is if you solidly plan your user journey from the start, where you've got players that are sustained for a long time. We need an end game, and it needs to be different, right, from what normal, as a beginning player is playing, but also mid-game players playing. So, again, I've seen done quite well in some titles is, we're looking to, first of all, doing PvE content is expensive, and it's difficult to maintain, and it requires a lot of effort to maintain it. Maybe it's beyond the capacity of some, or quite a lot of studios. But then, of course, you've got a solid thing with your PvP, and then tying into that competitive nature is something that just inherently will hold more attention for longer, just by the very nature. So I think in terms of, I was coming at it from a very strategic perspective early on, that's where you'd always start. You've got user journey, you're getting onboarded, you maybe got some narrative to hook you, and then you're into the systems, you're in the systems, you're sort of spending, you're doing whatever you need to do, quests, raids, etc. But then you get the end game, and I think what you're kind of referring to would be suited very well. And that can also, one rule of thumb, we always balance stuff with new players in mind, but in general you've got getting people to keep playing the game, the PvP aspects of it. I did see some stuff really well done. I think getting almost feeling like I mean, I'm a big sports fan, and I like seeing things in sports used in video games in certain ways, and games that have your ranked tournaments and the world tour mode, where the things moving around. It really does make you feel like you're kind of part of that community. Not the actual game community, but the whole game is creating this idea. It reminds me of when Wimbledon's on, everybody's interested in Wimbledon. It's that kind of feeling. If you can keep that going, maybe it's something to think about. Very kind of hypothetical, but I'm sort of just thinking.
No, it's all good. But you mentioned it sort of endgame. For me, to me, it's like the next hill. It's always presenting the next hill. So it's the end of. There's something to aim for, and I think you're absolutely right. If we don't have that thing to aim for, we're going to lose interest very, very quickly. But resetting that aim, reframing it aim, keeps it. And I'm a particularly big fan of the way Golf Clash in mobile did their tournament system, because it made it very personal by framing you into a group of 100 people, and every 3-5 days or whatever it is, the top 10% got promoted to another group of 100 people. Same system, just another group of 100 people. But of course, as you're progressing from a group, you're seeing other people that you're familiar with going with you, and eventually you find yourself at essentially a tournament group that is the same skill level as you and the same level of enthusiasm as you. And therefore it becomes a much more of a community focused principle, even though what you're doing is reframing the competitive landscape over a regular period of time. And that's not just a mobile thing, it's something I think logically could be leveraged everywhere. I mean, I'm a massive fan of, I could go on forever about things like soap opera based narrative processes. The fact that I'm a big fan of using data, config as content, which different ways of looking at it. But given that we've been talking for an hour, which has been fantastic, I'm going to have to say thank you very much, Charlie. You've been amazing. If people want to get hold of you, what's the best way for them to do that?
I think, in this context, LinkedIn is probably the best way to reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn, Charles Lees-Czerkawski on LinkedIn. It's my sort of full name.
And we'll put it all in the show notes on that note. And so, Charlie, thank you so much for that. Thank you for sharing that. And obviously, best luck with your book on game economy design. And we'll obviously reference that in ours. And obviously, I hope to catch up with you again soon. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Pleasure.